Hi YouTube, I'm Jack, a junior doctor working in London, and I've just finished my core surgical training. In today's video, I'll tell you how to go about preparing for the MRCS Part A. Timestamps are in the description and also up here, so just skip forward to the steps that you want to watch. As a disclaimer, I'm not being sponsored for this video at all, so all of this is just my honest opinion. Also, watching this video does not guarantee that you'll pass the exam. There are essentially two questions. Firstly, when in your career to sit the exam? And secondly, how long to leave to prepare for the exam. I sat my exam in the April of my foundation year 1, and I would also advise that you sit it as early as possible during your foundation years, and that's for the following reasons. 1, it scores you points on your core surgical training application, which in itself is a good enough reason to sit it early. 2, you get the exam out of the way early. 3, the later you leave it, the more you can forget how to sit down and study. The next question is how long to leave to prepare for the exam. When I was preparing for the exam, I was advised to leave about 4 months in order to study for it. What I actually did is about 6 months before the exam, I did the occasional bit of revision using a question bank, probably only a couple of days a week. And then about 3 months before the exam, I started to revise every day and go at it properly. So I think 4 months is a good guide if you're going to be revising regularly. In order to pass the MRCS Part A, I would say that it's essential to get some form of question bank, whether that's an online question bank or one in a book. Question banks are really useful because firstly, they highlight where the gaps in your knowledge are so you can focus your revision. Secondly, they allow you to test yourself constantly. Thirdly, I find the question banks are actually quite fun to do. There are many question banks to choose from. The one that I used was called MRCS, who are not sponsoring this video, by the way. I chose it because it was good value for money and it did cover all the necessary topics for the exam. Once I finished the MRCS question bank, I then thought I would try past test. I actually didn't end up doing that many of these questions, so I can't really comment on how useful it is. My revision strategy was to do some question bank questions, and then if I got any wrong, I would look those up in a book and make a flashcard. Once I completed the question bank, I would then go back and do all the questions I got wrong again, as there's no point doing the questions that you got right because you already know the answer. For textbooks, I used 2 books. The first was something called Basic Sciences for the MRCS, which is essentially a concise guide covering basic anatomy, physiology and pathology of surgical conditions tailored towards the MRCS. The other book I used was an anatomy atlas, Netter's Atlas of Human Anatomy, and this was just to help me visualize the anatomy a bit better. At the time, I didn't use any websites to revise, but if I were revising now, I would definitely use a website called Teach Me Anatomy, link in the description. This is essentially a free online anatomy textbook. I personally found it quite easy to read with some good diagrams, and it seems to cover a good range of anatomy for the exam. I've already touched upon the idea of using flashcards for revision. It doesn't matter if you use paper flashcards or online flashcards, as long as you make them yourself and they're easily accessible so that you could do them regularly. How you use them is also extremely important. What I'm referring to is a principle called spaced repetition, which allows you to be tested on flashcards that are either new or that you know less well. Doing this with paper flashcards can be a bit of a faff, so I recommend using an online flashcard system with spaced repetition built in. A good example is Anki, which I use now. To get the app on an iPhone does cost money. When I was sitting my MRCS Part A, I didn't want to pay the money, so I used something called Brainscape instead, which also has a web and an app version. It's free to use, and it doesn't matter which flashcards you use, as long as you actually use them. Personally, I find that Anki is a little bit better with its spaced repetition, so I'd probably recommend that more now. There are many MRCS Part A crash courses out there which aim to teach you the syllabus within a couple of days. I personally didn't pay to attend any courses for the MRCS Part A, although I did attend 1 or 2 teaching sessions in my hospital, which were delivered by surgical trainees at the time. I personally don't recommend MRCS Part A courses, mainly because you can gain a lot of the knowledge from reading from a book or doing question banks. I believe courses are most useful when you're getting practical experience or getting supervision doing something, so I think they are useful for the MRCS Part B OSCE or for core surgical training interviews, however not really for the Part A. Despite the boring name for this strategy, it's actually the most important one. You need to aim to be revising every day. Now, you may be working on a busy acute medical job or a surgical job, as I was when I was preparing for the exam, and I understand it can be hard to fit in the revision time. However, as with anything in life, if you really want to pass the exam and you prioritize it, then you will find time to do it. My strategy in the weeks before the exam was to wake an hour earlier and then do an hour of the question bank questions and flashcards. I did this because if I tried to do it after work, I would usually be too tired and not motivated enough to actually do them, and then I wouldn't do them. It does require going to bed an hour earlier and dragging yourself out of bed earlier, but once you get used to the early rises, I find that it's actually quite effective. An alternative is to book the examination during a less busy rotation with fewer on-calls, such as either GP, psychiatry, or palliative care. And actually, if I sat the exam again, I probably would have done this, as it avoids you burning out too much. When it comes to how much to revise during these daily sessions, I would advise setting a target of how long to spend revising, rather than how many question bank questions to do. When I started the revision, I can't have been doing more than 5 questions a day, and that's because every question I would pretty much need to be reading up on things and making flashcards and learning. I think this is a better strategy because if you invest in learning now, then later when you encounter the questions, you'll just be able to fly by because you already know the answer. A low-tech strategy that I used to keep committed was I'd take a piece of A4 paper and draw a table with the dates on one side and a tick box on the other. If I did my revision for that 1 hour, then I would be able to tick that box. This gave me a good visual representation of how much studying I was doing, and it's quite motivating to be able to tick boxes off. The final tip I have is actually the first thing that you should do if you want to prepare for the MRCS, and that's to book the exam. Imagine that you want to run a marathon and you tell yourself, I'll start training now, and then once I can run nearly the full distance, I'll book a race then. Inevitably, you probably won't get very far with your training. Instead, if you book the marathon first and pay the money, then you have that pressure to be able to run it, and you will run it. It's the same for the MRCS Part A. The first thing I did was to book the exam and pay that £550, because believe me when I say once you put money on the table, you are going to prepare for that exam. To book the exam, you can go to any of the Royal College of Surgeons websites. I've included some links in the description, so there's no more excuses now. You know what to do. Let's start today. Thanks for watching everyone. Make sure to check out my video on preparing my core surgical training portfolio. If you want to see more videos like this, please like and subscribe, as it tells me that this is the kind of video that I should be making. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments and I'll try and answer them, and I'll see you next time.